Hi, welcome to Literaturely,
a podcast about teaching literature.
I'm Margaret Mock.
And I'm Paige Wallace.
And today we're talking about adapting your literature class for the online classroom.
Because of the COVID, you, like us, probably switched your face-to-face class to an online environment in a sort of rushed panic somewhere or sometime during mid-spring. And that was damage control for most of us. And so what we're talking about this episode is the luxury of actually having time to plan a class as online, whether that's because you know you're going to teach online or if you're thinking of contingent plans. In case you do need to go online, you won't be in that damage control situation again, hopefully.
Yeah, I think at this point we just see more and more frequently schools are offering online courses, or that there's more reasons that we might have to adapt to the online forum. So I think what we're talking about today, while we're specifically talking about building a solely online class, everything is kind of adaptable for mixed modes or a traditional face-to-face course if you want to implement more digital techniques and resources in your classroom. But digital revolution's here, so
yeah,
we have to fix
yeah
it.
I mean, and most of these things that we're talking about today, like Twitter or Wix, we have used in face-to-face classes as well as in an online environment. And so even if you're listening to this episode and you're like, I'm not teaching online, or I'm only going to teach online out of necessity, you can still probably definitely use some of these same platforms and techniques and ways to just spice up your class.
I think one of the benefits of implementing digital resources in your traditional classroom or any class I've found is that it gives students like a more immediate understanding of the practical uses of your class, which encourages them to engage and do the work and show up, and then they'll start to see the other uses of your materials. But students are expecting everything they do outside once they graduate to be digital. So in some ways, like, responding to those changing needs creates a better rapport in the classroom, so you can tackle what maybe you're more interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can sell them on, like, you have to learn to build a website in this class and house your ideas about literature on that website. And so even if they're not that interested about their ideas for analyzing a text, you can usually interest them in this sort of technical side of it. And I think that in that process, they get more hyped up about sharing their analysis and sort of critical takes on text.
Yeah, and it's like one of those fun side effects is that because students get so excited about building the website, full disclosure, they will hate it the first week. They'll be mad about it. But after the first week, but by week 3, you'll hear them whispering to each other, like, I actually really like building this website, blah, blah, blah. And so they start to show each other, and then you have them looking at each other's work, and you've tricked them into being collaborative writers and scholars.
Yeah.
So
basically, we're saying we just, like, trick our students all the time. Yeah.
Yep. That spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. But so with all that, what sort of things can you implement? Paige has talked about Twitter and Wix, and I don't know, maybe we can dive into that.
Yeah.
For thinking about what are some ways we can structure an online literature class.
Yeah. So let's start with Twitter because that's more of like a weekly, daily discussion place, and then we can talk about Wix and the portfolio and whether or not you use blog posts or anything else you do with that Wix. But Twitter is fun because they are very bewildered by it, like by its use in class. Like a lot of times the first couple tweets to each other are like, this is so strange, I've never done like Twitter, I never thought I could do Twitter in class. But they tend to get out of those sort of stock answers, I feel like with discussion boards, you get like kids that or students that say some reiteration of what the person before them has said, and you can
Who's also the only person whose answer they
Yeah,
have read.
and so there are ways to around that in which you can hide the discussion post, but then they're working in a vacuum still, and they can't read what everybody else has said. And so I like Twitter because I think it has a little bit more. It's more organic. It tends to prompt real conversation and not just that sort of cookie cutter. I'm supposed to post 2 questions and a comment, and I use QQCs all the time, so like I'm not knocking them, but it gets us outside of that space where we feel like our students feel like, okay, I'm in a discussion board on Canvas or Blackboard and I have to be this certain version of myself. And I still want them to be that professional, like student-oriented version of themselves on Twitter, but there's more room for it. I can use hashtags, I can use images, I can use memes. I can have really...
It's not as performative.
Yeah. And so that's what I tend to use Twitter for. I use it for those discussions. I'll usually post a weekly thread that has a series of prompts in it, and then I'll also post on the lectures, like Easter eggs, where like you have to listen to the lecture or read the lecture in order to know what you're supposed to tweet. So it works in a way in place of quizzes, like reading quizzes for the lectures. So sometimes you can give reading quizzes where you test whether or not they actually read your lecture, because online they don't always read them or listen to them or whatever, or watch them. But when I put the Easter eggs in on the, like, I'll do a PowerPoint with a voiceover, and in that voiceover I'll say, so if you heard what I said today about such and such, then you should tweet your response to this quote or this claim. And then I know, like, okay, well, 6 of them did not listen or didn't listen closely and missed this.
As an aside, just because you brought up quizzes, I know that a lot of people hate quizzes, especially for literature courses, but I think for online you will find them more necessary than you would in a normal class. I think, Paige, what you just said is such a good way to get around that. But I have found it useful to use quizzes on the assignments, in that, like, when I need them to have, like, read the assignment description and know what we're doing, to quiz them on that, so that way I can catch the wild misunderstandings that sometimes arise from an assignment, especially when you have a more complicated assignment, so that way you don't have to dumb down your materials because you're worried about not being able to communicate them. But you also aren't going to get, half of the assignments responding to something terribly different.
Yes.
But I like that idea of using, like, the specific quotes and things like that. Something else I do with Twitter, which you mentioned, hashtags. I'll use hashtags to assign the small groups. So each small group has a different hashtag that they're using for that assignment. So that way they can find each other's tweets so far, what's going on, and respond to each other. And I'll require, for, like, the small group, that they have to tweet at least 5 times with their hashtag. And it can be a thread, and so if they, like, tweet a thread that has 3 tweets, that does count as 3 individuals, things like that. But then they'll have to maybe do, like, 10 tweets overall for the week, so that they might respond to another classmate's question, and that counts. Or tweet about something they're struggling with in class and ask for help. Or they might tweet something, like, that they found exciting in the readings. And then sometimes I also allow them, like, just to tweet about campus news. Mm-hmm. So if, like, they're part of, if we're teaching during a pandemic, you're not going to have those same sort of, like, campus performances. But in the past, like, if they're part of a campus performance, they can share that. Or once the pandemic started happening, they were tweeting their questions about that. Like, well, what's going on with grading? Are we allowed back on campus? Which allowed me in some ways to be like, that's still a rumor. Don't take that as fact. Like, do somewhat damage control. But it was nice because it allowed it still to have that classroom community feel of, like, when you're talking before class. Or
I allow, like, some of those casual exchanges as well. Like, it's not as performative as a discussion board, and so it's a good space for building community. I think that we also might want to talk about how we lay out this assignment for students, so in a way that deals with, like, what's acceptable to tweet and what's not acceptable to tweet, or, like, what you won't get credit for. Because I do have students, very few, but I have had a handful of students who don't read the Twitter assignment description, and they tweet about like what they had for lunch or something, and then they don't get that week's participation credit, and they're like, well, I did the 10 tweets, and it's like, yeah, you did the 10 tweets about like your trip to the vet with your dog, and you didn't actually tweet about anything that had to do with class. And so there are moments where you have to like clarify that this isn't a free-for-all space, that, you know, it is sort of more casual. I don't know if casual is the word I want to use, but it's outside of our official class website or Canvas site or Blackboard site, and so there's room for us to have a little bit more fun and be a little bit more true to ourselves, but that doesn't mean it's just a free-for-all.
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of the things that I stress in my overall Twitter assignment is that, one, they have to have a separate Twitter for class.
Yes, I do that too.
So if they already have a Twitter, they can't use it. And you're going to find that the majority of your students don't have a Twitter, that they're not using it, or, you know, have maybe used in the past but don't anymore. But that's fine. Twitter's pretty intuitive and user-friendly, and they figure it out within the first week for the most part. But then the second thing that I require off the bat is that to make clear that our class Twitter has to follow our civility clause, and have a clear civility clause in your syllabus about what sort of language is prohibited, what is just considered beyond the pale. Mine specifically says that I encourage you to express your ideas. You must always be respectful of your peers. No disrespectful, profane, abusive, or hateful language will be tolerated. This language includes, but is not limited to, racist, sexist, homophobic, or other direct inflammatory language. Should such language be used in your tweets, blogs, peer reviews, or other class conversations, you will not receive credit for the assignment and may face additional consequences. To be honest, I've never had a problem with a student doing anything hateful on Twitter. Most of them know that like the online space is a place where it can follow you and get you in trouble. Especially for freshmen, they've had that drilled in their heads about how they can get their college, application rescinded or what have you. But I know a problem that some of the other instructors we worked with have faced is like students liking porn accounts on Twitter and then those likes appearing in everyone's feed. And that's something has not happened in my class, but something that I would address in the future, of maybe just making them aware that people see your likes.
So I also have not had that problem, but I've heard the horror stories. And so I just let them know, like, hey, however you react on Twitter or whatever interactions you have, those are visible to your followers. So whatever you're liking should have to do with the class. Whatever you're retweeting, anything you do on that Twitter should be rooted in what we're doing in class.
Yeah, making it just clear that this is classroom discussion, I think, solves a lot of things. And then if you are an active participant and they see you tweeting, you're being a model for what sort of things they can or can't tweet. And one, if you're an active presence, they don't want you to see certain things, so they just won't cross certain lines. But there's also really fun things, like you'll have like plagiarism Twitter accounts, like try to solicit your students into buying essays from them, and your students will get very uncomfortable. I love it though, because then I get to come in and tell that robot account or whatever it is that our class knows what plagiarism is and how it works, and we're not interested, and do some sort of GIF. And the students will then, when it happens again, they delight in doing that sort of performance of plagiarism. I never.
Yes, I have very similar experiences, and it is fun. Yeah, so what's been your favorite like assignment or use of Twitter that maybe we haven't talked about yet?
So this is just sort of a nice thing at the end of the semester. I will have students give them the optional assignment, so it's not a small group assignment, of praising anyone whose work has stood out to them throughout the semester. And I tell them, make sure you tag that person. Like, if you're going to compliment them, they should see it. So, and so you get to see them just praise each other's work, but it also shows you what they understood the class to be about, where they're like, you did a really good job at insert assignment because blank skills. So it also is a reflection, but it solidifies that community, and it kind of, I think, gives them this unspoken permission that they can keep working together once the semester ends, even though they haven't necessarily met in person. Of, oh, right, like, I can, even though we worked on that thing a month ago, I can still talk to you about it now, and maybe we can do something in the future. In a more practical setting,
That's a really awesome assignment, though. Like, I'm just thinking, like, that's giving me, like, the warm fuzzies. I like it a lot.
It's a nice way to end the
Absolutely.
semester. And it's something that they wouldn't do in person, you know? Like, if you had everyone in the classroom face-to-face and it was like, who would you like to compliment? It would be so uncomfortable,
Yeah.
I think, for them.
Definitely.
But the screen protects them from that sort of feeling overly sentimental. But something that's worked for me really well was we did some work with thinking about accessibility of communications. And so they worked with they looked at the American Disabilities Act, and then they looked at some other texts. And in their small groups, they considered like other texts that they've seen that attempt to be more accessible and why they succeed or fail. And it's that one is not necessarily successful because we're on Twitter, but because they're doing all of this via text for the most part, they're already thinking about how the way they're communicating with each other is different than would it be in person. And then they're thinking about all the ways these sorts of communications, like each one has its own set of affordances and limitations, and how does it welcome or exclude different communities. That they're just coming at it from a different approach, and you see them like thinking about past communication through different lenses, where they're like, I never thought about this, or didn't realize that this would be so hard. So you see them like rethinking like hashtags, that if you have to capitalize like the first letter of each word in a hashtag for it to be read properly to visually impaired people who are online, and things like that. What about you? Because I know you've used Twitter differently than I have.
Well, mine is definitely not as impactful, I think. But an assignment that I really like across the board for any class that I've used Twitter in is that I asked them on the first day or during that first week to tweet a meme that describes their relationship to writing, literature, English classes, their past experiences, and then I ask that they explain it to us, right? Like, not in detail, like I don't need any horror stories of like the last English class you took, but that it becomes, some of them are really apparent, you know, like they'll have like that Dory meme that's like just keep writing or whatever, but some of them aren't as apparent, and I like to know. And then what I have them do at the end of the semester is think about how their ideas about the class and how it's relevant to them has changed, and what their new meme might be. And so the hope is that they all have a more sort of positive or beneficial outlook on the content and what we covered, and that they don't just, you know, reuse the same meme, but they can, right? And so if they do, and I've only had like 3 students do this, but if they do, then it gives me the chance to talk with them about like, well, what walls are you still hitting? And we usually do that in a sort of like public way, and like I let them know beforehand, like, you know, I'm going to ask you questions about your meme and what it means, and specifically how you think that relationship to these ideas changed or didn't change, and what kind of work needs to be done in the future. And so it's a really positive reflection activity.
Yeah, I like that it's both an icebreaker and wrap up. That's a nice full circle. And then you said something about, you know, talking publicly. And that's something else that's really nice about Twitter that you can use to your advantage, is like, whereas in face-to-face classes, I think everyone has it where students wait until after class to all line up and ask you those questions. I encourage them to ask them on Twitter rather than email me.
Yeah.
And then you can retweet that question with the answer, so everyone has that information. And I tell them off the bat, like, if you have a question, I guarantee at least 3 other people have the same question. And it just allows you to share information a bit more easily and not have those like 20 individual
emails. Yeah.
And I
think it also does something to create community, right? Community where you can ask questions, and you can not know the answer, and seek help. And so sometimes what I notice with that is a student will tweet a question, and before I get to it, because this is also helpful, I try to only monitor that Twitter between certain hours of the day, and I let them know, like, I'm only active on Twitter between 4 and 6 or something, because it can be one of those things that will take over your life if you don't turn it off.
Yeah.
And so
I will only have it up on my computer, never put it on your phone.
Because you'll just constantly respond to students. The lure is there. You're like, no, they need to know this right now, but they don't. They can wait. You can wait. It's really you're the problem. But I've lost track of what I was saying. Oh, nope, still gone.
No, I think I knew where you were going. That other students will answer the question for you.
Yes, right. So other students will jump in and they'll say, "Oh, you can find that in the syllabus or whatever," and then I just have to retweet like that little thread, and it's like great, because they're willing to help each other out. And then when they're bigger questions or they're bigger discussions, they've already like talked to that person in the virtual world, and so they're much more comfortable with doing it.
Yeah, they see their classmates much more as resources than they do in a face-to-face classroom.
Yeah.
Because they can't just wait for you after class. And the other thing that will come up is, like, if they don't know the answer, you'll have students say, I have the same question. Me too, me 3. Which also then lets you know immediately, oh, that's not something I explained fully,
right,
or that's something I need to tweak. So rather than, like, at the end of the semester when maybe you have frustrated students saying, we never did this, blah, 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 you're getting that feedback live, and so you can address the problem so there's not that buildup of resentment, but you also know what to fix.
Yeah, I love that aspect of using Twitter, because it really does show, like, when I have like 5 students across the board that aren't understanding a particular blog assignment or whatever it might be, then it really does give me the chance to publicly say, like, I didn't communicate this well with you guys. Let me give you some more information, and they appreciate that.
So we've talked a lot about
I know,
Twitter.
this episode's going to just be about Twitter. Let's switch.
We want to talk about, so structuring an online class in general, like if you're building it from the start, I think you'll have one issue you first have to grapple with is, what does your department or university require? I think increasingly we're seeing departments require that their instructors use the university platform, whether it's like Blackboard, Canvas, whatever. But if you have to use that, you have to use that, and hopefully your school will have resources that will help you build and see models. But if you have leeway, you might think about other platforms like Wix or Weebly, and that give you a little bit more agency over how it is built.
And also like Google Docs.
So I know, Paige, I've never used Weebly. I've used Wix, and I really like it, which is why I haven't used anything else. I don't know about you, though. Have you used
I used Weebly a long, dark time ago. And I 10 do not recommend it.
Okay.
Don't.
So these are the do's and don'ts.
It just was not a very user-friendly platform, and it crashed a lot. And I think this was like 5 years ago, and so maybe it's wonderful now. But I do also really like Wix.
Yeah, I think I strongly recommend writing a guide for your students once you have it figured out. Like, don't let them use ADI, because the ADI will want to solve everything for them, and if they make some sort of mistake, they don't like something, they mess it up, they can't
Margaret,
correct it.
Before you go into like the do's and don'ts of Wix. Will you tell us like exactly how you use it in terms of like how you use it as a platform and an assignment for them?
Yeah. So I have used Wix both in my composition classes and literature classes where they use it as a portfolio, but it's something that we start building from the very beginning of the semester. So the first week of class, day 1 or day 2, depending on how long the face-to-face classes are, we go over it in class, like this is how you sign in, this is how you make an account, these are some of the options they're going to give to you, I'm going to pick this random one and walk through it. And they have to send me their link to their own platform that first week. And I link every student's portfolio on a student page on my own Wix class or Wix site. And that Wix site, mine, is our class hub for the semester. So it's where I put like supplementary readings. It's where I put lectures, assignments, the syllabus, everything. And so we have our student page where everything's linked. And if we're using like a face-to-face class, it's still like where they will go to each other's sites to do each other's peer edits and things like that. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. I just have another question. So what do you think the perks are, or why do you choose to use Wix over a platform like Canvas or Blackboard?
So I think a few things. One, the selfish purpose is that it lets me keep my materials after I've left a university or if the university changes platforms. So while you and I were in grad school, we switched platforms and we got all those emails constantly of like, you need to remove your stuff now, you won't have access to it, blah, blah, blah. And it just made me think like, okay, I can save my readings, but would have to copy and paste individual like discussion board posts, things like that. Like you can only save so much from a platform. And I think that happened our first year, so I didn't really have that much, but it made me realize that I had no control over that platform and therefore I did not have independent access to my materials. And so I wanted to make sure I could keep my stuff. And by building my own platform, I got to.
Yeah, it's a totally valid reason.
Yeah, and in terms for my students, the reason I like it is, again, it gives them that immediate use where I explain to them from the get-go that when they go and apply for internships, their first jobs, and someone asks to see like a portfolio of their work, they have one. And they have one that will look polished. They can edit. I tell them, you can do whatever you want with this site after you get your grade from me. Like, I need you to keep it as is until I submit grades. But after that, that's all yours. So that way you can tailor it for whatever personal or professional goals that you have. And most of my students talk about, maybe they're not going to use the site we built for for our class together, but they do plan on building other portfolios for their own purposes. And it also allows them to invest in the work we're doing more immediately because there is some sort of like public component in terms of like collaborating together, sharing, all of that.
Other people being able to access their work, so not just peers. But
yeah.
I tell my students, I'm like, you're doing such good work, like, and now you have this portfolio with all the essays you've written and, you know, visual components or whatever, and you can like share this with your parents. They'll be super jazzed to see this, and you should be super like excited to show them. So they get this sense of like pride in their work. It's not just an essay that goes to die in the waste bin at the end of the semester.
Exactly. It gives it life outside the classroom, so it's not just what we're doing exists in this vacuum. So what made you decide to start using Wix? Because we came to this conclusion separately.
Well, so I started using Wix because I really wanted to use portfolios across the board or semester-long projects. And so I am really interested in projects that are like large projects in which you have several stepping stones for or building blocks for throughout the entire semester. And so especially in a research writing class or a literature class where we talk about how research is never just something you do over a 2-week period, I think there's more cohesiveness with Wix in terms of building a portfolio there, and more cohesiveness than just like they can see that cohesiveness. Whereas if I just use Canvas and I have blog posts and assignments and so on and so forth, discussion boards, it can be really hard for them to see how each of these things build on each other. But when I ask them to build a Wix portfolio in which, so I've done it group projects in a literature class with Wix, as well as like individual portfolios at the end of the semester. And so with the individual portfolios, they were examining a single, or I think they could pick between like 1 to 3 themes that they were examining over the course of 3 different texts. And so again, they worked on it throughout the semester. They had to have a certain number of blog posts. They had to have a certain number of annotated peer-reviewed sources. They had to have, and then like a final project uploaded there. With the group projects, I had students each take a particular text, a novel, and then come at it from a different angle and put that in a online space in that Wix portfolio. And so that was less, like that assignment was less of a whole semester assignment and much more of like a group couple of weeks assignment. Mm-hmm. But I like that Wix gives us the opportunity to work collaboratively and also to be able to really see that work in a polished space and in a space that's not just like a reflection of class, right? So like Blackboard and Canvas, like those are wonderful tools, but they're definitely the student in that, on that platform. Whereas Wix, they're the creator in that situation, and they get to make all these executive decisions and think about why they're making those decisions and how that translates to a larger audience, whether that's their peers or whoever else they might share their work with.
I really like thinking about that switch from like student to creator, and how that sense of pride is really going to change the way they invest in the work. I haven't thought about that component, but I think it's really true. I'm going to put you on the spot now and ask, so you talked about like some really cool projects that you've done with Wix. What has been your favorite thing you've done with Wix that you think, I wouldn't have been able to do this in a traditional setting?
Ooh, that's a hard question. So in a traditional setting, in a face-to-face class?
Yeah, like if you weren't using digital.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think I really enjoyed the group assignment where students created a website that looked at a specific angle for the text that they were reading. So, for example, we did Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones, and each website was about Salvage the Bones, but it had to be from a distinctly different angle. So, one was about reproductive health in African American girls. The other was about dogfighting and stigmas of dogfighting. And there were like 4 or 5. So obviously there was one about hurricanes. Then there was also a group that looked at junkyards in the South, and from like an ecological perspective. And so what they did is they put together a sort of home page that said like, why do we even care about this topic, right? So, and part of that was like establishing how they see it, that particular topic in the text. And then they had to put annotations for like 3 different articles, peer reviewed. And they had some guidelines for that. And then they had to each upload a response paper. And then the requirements for that included that like you just couldn't copy and paste your document on to the Wix page. You had to do something with it. So it needed to be a clear like sort of essay structure in terms of like the order of ideas. But so some people presented it as like more of like a web, and so it was really visual. I had a couple of students who read theirs aloud, like a TED Talk, and they were short. So I think they were like 500 to 700 words. And they were really excited about these projects. They were very proud of themselves. They chose their topics, and they wanted to talk about them.
I think that brings up a really important thing that instructors need to keep in mind too, that when you are making your online class, whether or not you're using Wix or Canvas or Blackboard or whatever, you can't just upload the materials you had for a face-to-face class and call it a day. You have to redesign your materials for digital space. So you have to think about, how are your students engaging with them? How are they going to be accessing them? And act accordingly. You might also think about like accessibility. So thinking about like black font on a white screen, we don't really tend to look at that for that long. Think about like people's problem with Kindle initially, right? Like it was like, ooh, this is jarring. And think about like what sort of font you're using. There's just a lot there. Even things like having alt text if you're having images, so that way visually impaired people still get those descriptions.
Yeah. And if you're using like a new version of PowerPoint, like if you use that as for some of your lectures, Microsoft has it where anytime you add a picture, it gives you the option, and if you don't change the alt text, then it gives a description of it. Sometimes those are good descriptions, and sometimes they need to be changed. But yeah, and so you might also think about like subtitles if you are or scripts, right? If your lecture is you talking and you've recorded it, does that video have subtitles? If it's a voiceover from a PowerPoint, do they have access to those scripts? And that can be a lot of work, but it really is necessary. You can ask questions too, in terms of like with students. I give that first day survey and I say, is there anything that I need to know? So again, I'm not asking them to disclose anything, but if they feel comfortable, I've had students say like, I'm colorblind, and so I need you not to use this color font or something like that. And that's really good to know off the bat.
Yeah, and just thinking about that with that in mind with your design. And there's a lot of resources, and maybe we could link some on our website to resources that help you think about visual design and what you can do as an instructor. Obviously, I know we didn't have any classes in grad school that taught us about accessibility and visual rhetoric. So it's not something that's necessarily in our wheelhouse, but it's going to help your students. And also it makes your stuff look better. So it's kind of a win-win, but...
Yeah, and so some of that also speaks to, in being accessible, you're also thinking about multiple different modes, and the ways in which people engage differently, right? And so the kind of biggest fear, I think, with online is that there's going to be a lack of engagement. And so how do you recreate the engagement that you get in a classroom in this online setting? And that can be really difficult, but some of that can come from the ability or the willingness to use multiple different sort of avenues, right? So not always giving handouts, not always giving videos, but mixing it up with a variety of different kinds of text and materials.
Yeah, so thinking about, like, we talked about Twitter as one way to have those, like, class discussions where they're engaging with, like, a text or with a lecture, but you could also think about having, like, a class discussion with something like Flipgrid, which, Paige, you've used in the past. So I kind of wanted to, I haven't used it, but from talking with you, it made me think about how maybe, like, you can do an initial Flipgrid where you read the passage you want your students to look at, like, as a group, and then end with, like, a question that they then respond. So can you talk about a little bit about how Flipgrid exactly works?
So Flipgrid is like a academic Instagram, but with videos, right? Or so maybe like an academic Snapchat is a better version of it. And so I did use it for discussions. I used it on the fly in the spring, so it was damage control. I had these wonderful classes. Like, I just had really good students last semester, and they were all really invested in each other and enjoyed each other's company, and it was mutual, right? So when we all went online, I got like a lot of emails sort of just like kids being sad that we weren't going to see each other. I started using Flipgrid as a way for that interaction with like an actual person. I didn't want to incorporate Twitter in the middle of the semester, but I also didn't just want to use the discussion boards. I also felt like students were struggling emotionally during this time, and being able to like see each other and talk with each other via the internet in this really, really immediate way could help them like sort of process like everything just abruptly changing.
But it also sounds like long term that would be useful, like not just in a pandemic, but for more normal situations where like it allows you to like establish your persona as the instructor, like your personality, but also foster relationships between your students and each other and your students and yourself, and create that community really, really easily. Almost.
Yeah, and so some things I like about Flipgrid is you decide how long the videos are. So as the moderator, and so you can I would post a prompt, like we might watch a TED Talk or read something, and then I would post a prompt about asking them questions, and it also had that face-to-face quality of like I could begin a video or a week's worth of videos with like a how's everything going? How are you guys? Tell me something interesting that's happened to you this week. And that would be a freebie, right? But then the next one would be, hey, we watched this TED Talk and here's some quotes that I found really interesting. Can you respond to them? Or can you give me some quotes that you found on your own? And then I would also prompt them to also respond to one of your classmates or two of your classmates or so on and so forth. It was all, again, by the seat of my pants. And so like if when I use it again, I would sit down and think about like, so for every post, how many do they respond to, so on and so forth. But it went well. There's some things I encountered. Students are uncomfortable at times with their face being on the internet. It's not a public platform the way that Wix is, so no one can access it unless I give them access to it. So that's really good. I can reassure them with that. But I also gave students that were uncomfortable the option of just record the blank wall and you talking. And most of them took that option. But I did have 2 students who did not want to do it at all. And I just let them email me their responses. Again, I think that's something I would think about. Like, what are the alternatives to this? Do I need to give an alternative? But very clearly in this situation I did, because none of my students signed up for an online class in the beginning. And so they weren't prepared for that kind of interaction. And so I think those are things that you might want to think about before you start using it, and how you navigate that. Like what's a fair answer to that question of, can I just email you my answer? Because I think that generally I want to say no, because there is some value to that platform and I'm using it for a specific reason. But yeah, it's complicated, I think.
Yeah, it is. And I think maybe there's like ways you can think about if you adapt it in other places, like what the benefits are, also like what you lose. Like I'm thinking, well, maybe there's something there like where you can do, again, like with Twitter, like where you post a video of yourself, but you put it on Twitter and you ask your students to respond, and they can either respond like with a video of themselves or in text, but then you don't get to have the same sort of parameters. Like I like that idea, like one, Flipgrid is private, so it's like you're in the classroom walls, that like little sanctuary we can create, but also you can like set up for how long. I didn't realize that you could do that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And they can do things like put emojis over their face. So, like, Flipgrid seems to be aware that, like, some students are not going to be comfortable being on camera. And also some instructors are going to be like, cover the face. Like, and so you can do things like that that make it fun and, lighten the mood around it. So it's not so we don't have to take ourselves so seriously in that space. Yeah. And the thing I wanted to bring up with all of these platforms is that your role is to model how these work for your students. And so part of what I think has been successful in online platforms is doing that work of modeling. So creating the Wix site so that then they can see what that looks like. Having an active presence on Twitter so that you can build community and they can also take cues from you. Same thing with Flipgrid, having that active presence so that they can see like, oh, this is what I do. So I never just like post a prompt and disappear. I post a prompt and then when they start responding, I do responses to them. And, it's not, with Flipgrid, you have to have a quiet space to do that, right? Unless you want to have like a kid screaming in the background, which probably happens for me on my end. But it's not such a taxing sort of response. I find it less taxing than like responding to traditional discussion boards. I like that interaction with the students. And so I'm excited about it. I'm excited to see them and hear their thoughts. And again, I think I get less cookie cutter versions of them in those spaces like Twitter and Flipgrid.
Yeah, I think the less cookie cutter, that's really, I think, what's exciting about all this is that by exploring these new platforms and taking risks, you're going to model that for your students. So by giving them these non-cookie cutter assignments, you're going to get non-cookie cutter responses, and you're going to see them think about ideas differently, invest in the work in new ways because it seems fresher, it seems more immediate. As like an aside, I did a digital annotations assignment with my students, which I think most of us can attest to the fact that students don't want to annotate for the most part. My students did this so well. I was so excited, where they had to take a passage from the Odyssey that we were working with, and it was super short. The passage that they would select, they could pick whatever, but I think it was somewhere like 10 to 15 lines. And then they had to come up with 4 annotations, and they were doing it online, so they could play around with how they wanted it to appear. If they wanted it to be like in boxes next to the text, if they wanted it to be like footnotes, and they could like play with anchors and things like that. If they wanted pop-ups or hyperlinks or whatever they thought would be most useful. And they were annotating both like where they had to like break down like what techniques were being used, but also they had to have 2 annotations that were about the content and like what it was referencing and all that. And it was such good work. I was so afraid to grade this assignment because I thought it was going to be too complicated. I thought they were going to give, SparkNotes summaries. And they didn't. They went above and beyond because they were like, I don't know what to do, so I guess I have to try. So things like that, like you can take risks with like the close reading assignments or the analysis papers, like what you were saying, Paige, where like they have to adapt it for the new medium, and it's gonna make them think on their feet, I think. So they're not just regurgitating what they did in high school or previous classes.
Yeah, speaking of that, I told you before, I'm planning to try out Padlet for annotation, and I'm gonna create my own version of Padlet annotations so that they can use that as like a study resource, but then also to see what it looks like. So when I do that, we can add that to the resources page.
That'll be exciting. Okay, so I guess we can start wrapping up today's episode. And first, we just want to hear from you what questions you still have about online classes. This is just sort of, we've covered a lot, but we're also just dipping our toes in the water. This is Wild Wild West for everyone. So what questions do you still have? What's worked for you already? What concerns have come up? Problems? Issues?
Yeah. I think also we might, since we are pretty tight on time right now, we might think about, instead of I don't know, I'm doing this on the fly, so Margaret, you can override me. Mm-hmm. Instead of sharing our dream course right now, maybe we could ask, like, what is your dream online course?
Yeah.
So share that with us, and we can, I don't know, maybe we'll do a part 2 for this. Again, I'm going rogue here, but we covered a lot more than what we thought, and
it's a coup.
Yeah, and so if we do a part 2, then we would definitely want to share some of your dream online courses.
Yeah, what do you think you can teach online that you might not be able to pull off in a face-to-face classroom?
That's such a really interesting way to put it, right? So like instead of thinking of online as like the strife of your life, nice rhyme, anyway, instead
I hope you had the strife of
your
life.
So what are the perks of it? How do you make it work for you? What can you do to make it exciting, and also what opportunities do you have that you wouldn't have in a face-to-face?
I'm excited to hear from everyone because I think this is something that we're going to have to keep tackling, and the more resources we can all share, the better we'll all be.
Yes. All right, Margaret. Bye.
Bye.